Hi, I'm Helen Noh. It's an honor to be presenting here today. I'll go over, the current state and problems of adoption practice in Korea. So I'll just go ahead since I have over 40 pages. I don't know. I'll have to be careful with time. So just let me know if I'm going too long. The first page, I just wanted to show you how adoption system works in Korea, where you would find that in most countries, adoption would be like part of the whole child protective service continuum or child care service system. But in Korea, adoption ages is like separated from the other part where you have a child in need of care and you would decide whether to place the child in foster care group home or child welfare institution. But for adoption, mostly married mothers, mothers who want to place their children for adoption would have to go to adoption agencies. And it's completely separated from the whole system. And the adoption agencies decide whether they want to take the child or not. And once the child is taken, they actually care for the children too. They have their own foster care and child care institution that they use to care for the children who are waiting for adoption. And then, you would pursue domestic adoption first, and then after 5 months, they can pursue overseas adoption. So it's completely a separate system right now. And we're trying to somehow integrate that. We're, trying to push for that. And there's a talk, or there definitely is a move toward that, but nothing is finalized yet. The Korean adoption process, if you could see, this is the process that they go through. I would say it's not really practice. It's more like procedure, where you don't have, I would talk more about it, but it's less of a social work practice, but more of paperwork type of work. Main process is whether they have the proper papers. Adoption home study is done, but it varies so much depending on the social worker who does it. And there are some few questions that they have to answer. And once that's done, there's child matching, papers to family court approves. Well, because it depends on the family court. You have Seoul family court, they have professionals called investigators who would sometimes do the whole home study process because the judges do not trust the adoption agencies to do a good job. So adoptive parents complain that it's taking so much longer after the revision of Special Act on Adoption, which happened in 2011. Then you have child placement, reporting of adoption, and then post-adoption review service for 1 year. Well, you probably know all this, but just to somehow talk about how Korean adoption practice is so far behind. You know, I'm gonna just briefly mention what adoption actually is. It's permanent alternative care. It's a social legal process that makes it possible to form a family through a method other than giving birth. Child welfare service that has the greatest impact on a child throughout his or her life. And so adoption practice should be, as you all know, it should be child-centered. The child's best interest should be the paramount consideration. But in Korea, the general perception of adoption is that adoption is a good deed. Adoption is a beautiful and noble act of love. And we should try to place as many children in the loving arms of adoptive parents as quickly as possible. So promoting domestic adoption is the best way to protect children in need. That's how our society perceives adoption. So there's pressure to simplify adoption procedure. You know, even after the revision, there's that, and that often results in tragedies like, you know, deaths of adopted children from abuse. And you know, I don't know if you know the cases we've had, Daegu case and Pocheon case, and lately we had another case of Chongin. You probably heard about the name, you know, Yangcheon case. Those are the cases that really got a lot of attention from the media, but there are other cases too. So I'm going to talk about Daegu's Bombyk case because the recent case, we really didn't have, get an opportunity to do an investigation. We tried to find a lawmaker to help us do that, but we couldn't find anybody because we did a case investigation on Bombyk case. And after that, we tried to revise the law. And the lawmaker who worked with us got such criticisms and visits from, you know, attacks from adoptive parents, so much of that. So no lawmaker wants to go through that again. Well, no, they didn't want to until the case got mass, you know, attention from mass media. So we had some seminars after that, but we still haven't done investigation on the latest case. So I'm going to talk about the case that we did investigation on, Daegu's Bombyk case. I'm going to talk about the problems with Korean adoption practice that we found from our investigation. We found that, you know, there was mistaken perception and unprofessional practice overall in this case. Especially the director of the adoption agency was very much involved in the whole process. And it's, again, the society's perception is similar to that. It's best to place a child in an adoptive family as early as possible. And the second pre-adoptive foster home that the child was placed, that's where she died. These parents, the director thought, will be able to raise any type of child because they've already raised 4 adopted children successfully and have even sent one of the children to study abroad. I don't know why sending a child to study abroad is such a wonderful thing, but they thought, you know, sending a child, adopted child, spending that much money to send a child to study abroad was a great thing. But, you know, that's how they thought about this adoptive parents. So, and another thing was this When they placed Eunbi, I don't know why, but Eunbi was a child who had experienced so many separations already. She was separated from her mom. Her mom tried to raise her, but she was young. She was 17. She still hadn't finished high school. She had to earn money. So she tried to raise her, but couldn't. So she placed the child in 24-hour daycare, where she had to pay money to have the daycare take the child. And she couldn't afford it anymore. So she put her in child welfare institution. And there when she saw her child there with other children, she thought that it would be best for the child to be adopted to a family. So she went to an adoption agency, and there Eunbi stayed in an institution for almost 10 months before she was placed in the first pre-adoption foster home. And then this final home where she died was, the second foster home, well, pre-adoption, where it was assumed that she would be adopted, but she was placed there before adoption. But Eunbi was placed simultaneously with a younger boy who wasn't even related to her. And that's such unprofessional practice, but that was what was done. So the practice that did not consider the best interest of the child, and there was insufficient pre-placement preparation and education provided to pre-adoptive parents, and very unrealistic expectation of adoptive parenthood. And then we had another case, Pocheon case. We didn't, this wasn't, was an adoption through civil adoption system. They don't go through adoption agencies. The birth parents, the birth mother, and the pre-adoptive parents, they can just agree between them that, the child will be given, and the adoptive parents would just legally make it. They don't have to go through any adoption process or education or agency. So there was serious negligence found in civil adoption procedure. The adoptive father was convicted 10 times for fraudulence and violence. That wasn't even considered. No evaluation of pre-adoptive parent suitability to adopt was carried out. No pre-placement preparation and education was provided to pre-adoptive parents. No post-adoption review was conducted to monitor child safety and adjustment. So it's need for revision of civil adoption system. Now they have 3-hour education, pre-adoptive education provided, but that's it, not much. So current adoption practice problems are revealed through the case of Eunbi. I'll just go through one by one. So pre-placement, you look at the home study. As you know, home study, the goal is to prepare and educate pre-adoptive parents for successful parenting of an adopted child, and to determine pre-adoptive parents' suitability and ability to parent an adoptive child, to gather information needed to determine the types of needs pre-adopted children have that pre-adoptive parents will be best able to meet. So home study is a process that evaluates the willingness and ability of pre-adoptive parents to provide a healthy and secure family environment to an adopted child throughout his or her life. So adoption professionals should be equipped with a high level of expertise to determine what is in the best interest of the child. And these are Ministry of Health and Welfare provides this adoption practice manual where it says that pre-adoptive parents home study should include the 7 items. And if you look at the sheet, they have just very small spaces for each category. So it depends really on the social worker how much to put in there. And then there is this rule about making visits at least twice to home, workplace, or neighborhood, and should visit at least once without notification. I don't know why you should visit. I mean, the process, if the home study is really done well, visiting without notification is like, I mean, this, I just don't understand that, but this is what's in the manual. Case of Unbi, the placement with first pre-adoptive parents, so was pre-adoptive foster care actually, took place 4 months and 20 days after the parents submitted their adoption application. And if you look at the process, different stages of the home study process were handled by different adoption professionals. There were like 5 people involved. Education was done by one, and intake was done by one other worker. Every process was done by different workers. And the placement, the second pre-adoptive parents, it just took 1 month and 10 days ago. So they just went through the compulsory education and was done. And probably because they've already adopted 4 kids, you know, just everything was shortened. And placement education, it's supposed to, you know, help pre-adoptive parents to understand the various issues that adopted children and families face after adoption. And part of home study process that enables observation and evaluation of pre-adoptive parents' potential ability to raise an adopted child in a child-centered manner. But when we investigated the placement education were provided by the Korean adoption agencies themselves. The revised law says the employees, the professional, I mean, social workers who are doing the adoption need to get 8 hours of education every year. That's very insufficient, but when we looked at what happened, I got just confused. This is the adoption pre-placement education for pre-adoptive parents. Yeah, so it's 8 hours. That's not very much, but the education was done mainly lectures. Now it's all online. So I'm worried even more. And there was really not much, the content was not focused on raising adoptive children. 4 hours were allotted to administrative procedure, how to go through the adoption procedure, and, you know, when you can dissolve adoption, even that was part of it, and what you can receive, the benefits you can receive once you adopt. And then 4 hours, there was a case presentation. You know, usually a mother who just adopted an infant is very overjoyed, happy. She talks about her case. And then there was a lecture on child rearing, but not specifically about the issues that adopted children go through. So not very helpful. Parent-child matching was done by the director in this agency mainly. And you could see, so this family raised 4 children successfully. So these parents will be able to deal with any child. And Unbi has just been removed from one pre-adoptive home. So this family would be, great. That's what she thought. And this is what happened. And this matching in Korea is all done within the agency. So they take in the children, they take in the parents, and the matching only happens between the children and parents that they have available within the agency. But if we look at our law, was revised in 2019, says the agency should provide information on adopted children and families to the National Center for the Rights of the Child to enable efficiency in adoption practice and build a system of cooperation among adoption agents. So they could have an integrated system where they could have a pool of children and pool of adoptive parents and try to match parents who could best raise the children who are waiting adoption. And the information that they're supposed to provide are like the children, the name, resident registration, address, everything, disability, illness of children referred for care to adoption agency. And then the birth parents, their information, and then the pre-adoptive parents. But not one adoption agency has provided the required information to this state. Not one. They're all breaking the law, but nobody's doing anything about it. And then with pre-adoption placement, actually, our law says adopted child should be placed with adoptive parents only after the adoption is approved by court. But we see with case of Unbi, she was placed twice in 2 different homes. First placement was pre-adoption foster care without family court's adoption approval. Pre-adopted parents returned the child after being with her. They said she eats too much. She doesn't listen to the mother, only is attached to the father. Those were the reasons she was returned. The second placement, pre-adoption foster care without family court's adoption approval again. And then she was reported, abuse was reported on the child twice. The first time, the hospital doctor said, oh, that family abuse, it's not possible. So no grounds. The agency was defending the family throughout the process, even through court. Child was found brain dead from abuse. The second report. And then while the family is going through the court process, and after the child was found brain dead, there was an adoption approval by family court. So she actually with her funeral was in the name of this second adoptive home. She had to use the family name of the second adopted father, which is really strange. So nobody really reported or let the family court know what was happening. And this is because all rights to the child is given to adoption agency once the child is referred for adoption. And so that adoption agency has no obligation to let the mother know or other related agencies. With post-adoption services, our law says that adoption agencies should provide following post-adoption services 1 year after adoption approval to help adoptee and adoptive parents to adjust to each other, observe the level of adjustment between adoptees and their parents, and provide services, provide information, or also provide a setting where they can request counseling. But as I said, social perception and expectation toward adoptive parents is you have this expectation that adoptive parents are noble and remarkable people. Plus, there is very little appropriate post-adoption services available, lack of adoption experts. So adoptive parents are reluctant to ask for help even when they're having a difficult time raising their child. They try to resolve their child rearing problems by themselves and tend to perceive that child rearing problems are caused by defects adoptees came with. And so it could go to extreme situation like what happened with Untitled. So we still do not have official system of post-adoption services. Only through NCRC we have, they ask for participation and consignment. And the main post-adoption services provided to adoptive families are psychological, emotional therapeutic problems, educational problems, financial support for events or self-help groups. But actually, it's difficult to access post-adoption services, and there's overlap in services, and services are concentrated in Seoul and Gyeonggi area. And so adoptive families tend to turn to online cafes or community groups for help, not experts. And then we have the adoption agent practitioners qualification and education training. The qualification is not very high. Even public employee who's were focused in child welfare for over 3 years, even though they did not major in social work or related field, they could still work there. Any people with work experience over 2 years in related field can work there. And now in the law, the heads should receive 4 hours of in-service training, and employees should receive 8 hours training. But I looked at the content of the training, and main content consisted of administrative matters. Again, they would also talk about promoting ways to promote domestic adoption, and they said that's education they received. Or they would ask some people to talk about narrative therapy, solution-focused therapy. That's their education. And adoption workers within the agency would also give a few hours talk, and that would be training. So it really does not, the education that was provided really did not contribute to the increase in expertise, adoption expertise of the professionals working there. And actually, when there are studies shows that 52% of adoption agency workers who participated in this education thought it wasn't helpful in helping them to conduct family home studies. So you could see how there's a lot of problems with our Korean adoption practice. And we're talking about how the government should take more responsibility. Why I'm going to talk about why the public responsibility should be secured. Well, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and Hague Adoption Conventions talks about these things. Central authorities should make final decisions regarding the child's adoptability. And also inappropriate financial gain from adoption procedures should be prohibited. But if you look at, when you look at inter-country adoption, who is in charge in most sending and receiving countries? In Europe, I think almost all countries, public agencies are in charge of core adoption practices. In the US, it's two-track, as you know. Those from abusing neglect and whose parental rights are terminated, adoption of these children through the government. And then you have private agencies dealing with international adoption and also open adoption. And you even have lawyers working there. So I'm not so sure about the US system, but they did sign the Hague. So they're doing more accreditation and all that. And actually the workers qualification, or when I was in the US, I worked at an adoption agency in the US, but there, at least people had MSWs, and there was a lot of training within the agency, and there's a, importance given to ethical, practice. But in Korea, private adoption agencies are in charge of core adoption practices. Only after the revision of Special Act on Adoption, the family court, finalizes, approves the adoption, but the main procedures, everything is done by the adoption agencies. If you look at, comparing three countries, all these countries are sending countries. And you could see all this process in two countries, Czech Republic and Philippines, are handled by the government. In Korea, it's all handled by private adoption agency. Care for pre-adoptive child, adoption agencies are taking care of children. Adoption consideration period, we have only 1 week after delivery. Approval of suitability to adopt, no government approval before matching. Matching is done very arbitrarily. So to pursue domestic adoption, that's 5 months. Matching, again, adoption agencies do it. Determining children's adoptability, again, adoption agencies. Matching in intercountry also. So why is it a problem for when a private adoption agency handle core adoption practices? This is why. In Korea, the displacement of the original goal of intercountry adoption by continuance of the practice to serve the needs of adoption agencies and the countries involved. So original goal of intercountry adoption was to solve the problem of orphaned or abandoned multiracial children. And it has continued for over 60 years now. And reason for continuance, adoption agency administrations, they fulfill their organizational maintenance needs. They need the money. It makes a lot of money for the adoption agencies. Korean government, we don't need to do anything about problems with children in need. You just send them over. So child welfare programs cannot develop. Receiving countries, US, I'm sure, European countries, it meet the demand from families wishing to adopt, especially very young infants or young children who are healthy. Adoption agents' problem with transparency regarding their income and expenditure. Well, there was only one study done with on the organization structure, staff, and expenses of adoption agencies. They won't reveal them. And this was done recently because the adoption agencies really now want the government to fund them for personnel and for operation now, because overseas adoption has really declined. Now they are willing to have the government pay them and to maybe supervise them a little bit. So it's like 2017, that's the first time where they really, really revealed. And this study was based on what the adoption agencies gave them, because they are receiving a lot of government funding now, especially for the care of the children. But for many, many years, they had so much money from overseas adoption, they didn't have to depend on the government. So they didn't have to show what they have, even if they are requested. And you could, when in this study, you could see that especially the three adoption agencies who are handling intercountry adoptions, they're doing the same work, but their organizational structure, staff, and expenses differed greatly. Number of child counselors ranged from 33.3% to 65.6%. And the personnel varies so much, and you wondered why there's so much difference. And then the estimated expenditure for a child for intercountry and domestic adoption, well, almost 3 times, yeah, over 3 times more for intercountry adoption. But I worked for Holt when in 1981. I handled like 8 agencies, US agencies. I did most of the matching there. And I mean, it doesn't take a lot to do intercountry adoption. Domestic adoption takes so much more effort, but you could see, I don't know how they calculate such, expenses. The difficulty, I don't have much time. Let's see. When private adoption agencies handle co-adoption practices, like I said, they need to share information to have a pool of children and pool of parents to match the best, to do the best matching. But as I said, no agency has provided that information. Actually, the law was revised in 2019, but from May of 2006, there was a recommendation that they share information. And in Korea, people think there's always more children waiting adoption than pre-adoptive parents, but there was a special audit of adoption agencies in 2008, and actually there were more than 559 more pre-adoptive parents waiting to adopt than children waiting to be adopted. But they could not be matched because the agencies did not share information with each other. The child's best interests often do not become the paramount consideration in practice. One example is continuation of proxy adoption for almost 60 years. Pre-adoptive parents of intercountry adoption could adopt a child by just completing the paperwork. They did not even have to travel to Korea to meet and pick up their children. And that would make a lot of difference in terms of caring for the child, understanding the child. But that was much more efficient for the agencies and very convenient for the parents too. I think in the long run, it didn't serve the parents well. And in proxy adoption was strongly opposed and criticized by adoption experts from the very start, but it was continued for 60 years almost until when the Special Act of Adoption was revised. And then the phenomenon of adoptee deportation recently, we have increasing number of Korean adoptees in the US who have become involved in criminal activities are being deported to Korea because their adoptive parents failed to naturalize them. And the only reason for adoptee deportation is that US government, Korean government, and Korean adoption agencies, US American adoption agencies did not make sure that Korean children adopted to American families were naturalized. Then national disgrace. Korea is a country with the highest number of children adopted overseas. Korea is the country that has practiced intercountry adoption for the longest time. In 1980s, we had the highest number of intercountry. That's when 1988, that's when we had Olympics. But in 1985, for every 100 children born in Korea, 1.3 children went overseas for adoption. And now China is the highest number of children being adopted overseas, but when you calculate that in terms of number of children born, we are sending 8 times more children than China even now. And then exclusion of children who need adoption services. I found this just recently. I didn't even realize this was happening. Only very young and healthy infants are considered for intake by adoption agencies. Private adoption agencies in Korea are counseling birth parents and then decide which child they want to accept for adoption. They don't accept all children. They're not accepting children who really need adoption. I will talk a little bit more about that later. And these private agencies also, as I told you, run foster care institutions to raise these children that they've accepted. And our Special Act on Adoption gives complete right to the adoption agency. Birth parents' parental rights are suspended from the day the child is surrendered to an adoption agency. And their parental rights can be exercised only when they withdraw their consent to place their child for adoption. So Eunbi's mother did not know what was happening to her child until the child was brain dead. And it's not even the adoption agency that let her know. It was the Unmarried Mothers organization reached out. Head of an adoption agency becomes a guardian to the child, surrender to the adoption agency from the day the child is surrendered until the day the adoption is completed. So they have complete control. And this is an example from Baby Box Project report. The babies there sometimes, adoption agents refuse to accept a child with cleft palate because taking care of the child would cost more and require extra labor. That was what was found in this report. Adoption agency refused to accept a healthy child because the child's mother was intellectually delayed. This is what's happening. And I was involved in a study, and I was interviewing a birth mother, and she talked about how her baby was sick for a week after she was born, and she completely recovered. But 2 out of 3 adoptions agency handling intercountry adoption refused to accept her child because she was sick for 1 week. And then I'm part of this child welfare review committee. We decide how, where to place the children in need who come up to that committee. And a child was, we were supposed to decide what to do with the child. And this child was raised by his unmarried mother for 16 months, but the unmarried mother really had a hard time, and she finally decided to place the child for adoption, but no adoption agency would accept the child because he was too old, 16 months old. And then preference given to intercountry adoption over domestic adoption by adoption agencies. I had a pre-adoptive mother. I'm running this pre-adoptive parent education for those wishing to adopt a child of 1-year-old age or older. This is a new education that was developed after Bomby's case. She stated that she and her husband expressed a wish to adopt a child of 1-year-old, 1 or older to their adoption agency, and she replied that the agency did not have any child that age and that they should search for a child welfare institution themselves to find a child they could adopt. And it was very strange because when I was running this education, most parents already had a child designated even before they finished all this process. And some families even had the child home already. And the adoption agency said, we don't have children of 1 year of age or older, but in reality, 97% of children adopted overseas from adoption agencies in 2018 were children between 1 and 3. So it appears that adoption agencies choose to place a child overseas once the 5-month compulsory period to pursue domestic adoption expires, even when there are Korean or pre-adoptive parents wanting to adopt a child older than 1. So this is what happens. Actually, well, I will talk about this maybe in connection with this. Social perception in Korea toward a continuation of intercountry adoption in the reality. When we say, well, Korea is such a rich country, why do we have to continue overseas adoption? And many people think that we have to continue because children with special needs, such as older children, children with disability, and children in child welfare institutions, they need to be adopted, but Koreans only want young and healthy children. That's what they say. But the reality, if you look at the statistics, I was really surprised to find out that 2018 is the latest statistics because of the change in organizations. They haven't come up with the 2019 statistics, so I only have 2018. Only 9 out of 303 children adopted overseas were 3 years and older, while over 10% of children adopted domestically were 3 years. So you have more older children adopted to Korean families. And how does this happen? Because adoption agencies only taking very young and healthy children. And then once the 5-month period is over, they send them overseas. And so parents who want to adopt older children, they go to the institutions and find their children and then ask the adoption agents to process them. So you have more domestic families with older children. Children with disability. I didn't realize this, but from 2014, the category of disability has been eliminated from adoption statistics. They do not accept children, even children who were sick for one week and completely recovered, they won't accept. So they don't have any child with disability. And now with the categories, healthy children, children with health problems. And children with health problems, what are they? Children with jaundice, or those mothers who had a history of smoking or drinking while they're pregnant, they're considered children with health problems. And children from institutions, 99.7, almost except one child, all children adopted overseas were children of unmarried mothers, in contrast to 83.3% of children adopted domestically. So, sorry, I took longer. That's it. Yeah, the reality is really the private adoption agencies being in charge of all this adoption process is creating so many problems in Korea, and we really need to have more public responsibility secured soon. Thank you.